10 things that climate change and coronavirus have in common. Number 1, they both start with a C. Yes, I know. That's very obvious, but I couldn't skip it. What's number 2? Number 2 is that we were warned about both of them a very long time ago, both climate change and pandemics. We've known since the 1800s that digging up and burning coal at that time, oil and natural gas later, was producing heat-trapping gases that would cause the planet to warm. Mrs. Eunice Foote, in a paper that she wrote for the AAAS meeting in 1856, speculated that if CO2 levels were higher, that the planet would be warmer. And scientists have gone back and recalculated based on her research that she could actually, if she had known, calculated a value of climate sensitivity from her experiment that's very similar to the mid-range IPCC value today. A contemporary scientist in the UK, John Tyndall, was the first to link methane emissions to coal mining, as well as studying the warming impacts of methane and carbon dioxide. And Svante Arrhenius, a physical chemist in the 1890s, calculated how much the world would warm if we increased levels of CO2 in the atmosphere by 50%, 100%, 150%, 200%. Of course, he thought that would take thousands of years, not realizing that how much coal and gas and oil we'd be using. By 1965, 55 years ago, scientists were confident enough in their understanding not only of the science, but of the negative impacts of these changes on human society and civilization, that they formally warned a U.S. president of the risks of climate change, and that president was Lyndon B. Johnson. Then there was Jim Hansen testifying to Congress in 1988. There were the IPCC assessments that began in 1990. The National Climate Assessments that began in 2000. I don't know how many National Academy and Royal Society reports, but if you go to Google Scholar today, which I just did, and you type in climate change, you get 2.4 million hits for that phrase, and if you add global warming to it, you get 4.4 million hits. It wasn't just the scientific community or the political community that knew about it. Exxon scientists were studying climate change almost 40 years ago. Ford and General Motors scientists knew about the impacts of burning gasoline on climate as well. We've known about climate change for a very long time, decades to centuries, and we've known about the impact of pandemics for even longer. Pandemics have been around as long as there have been humans on this planet, pretty much. There's the 10 plagues of Egypt that they talk about in the Bible. Of course, not all of them are illnesses, but the concept of a plague sweeping across a nation is ancient. In our own history, we know about the bubonic plague or the Black Death that swept across Europe in the 14th century. Then there was the flu pandemic of 1918-1919, which was just 100 years ago. Then, of course, we know that in 2002 there was SARS, and then a few years after that there was the bird flu, and then in 2009 there was the swine flu. There have been fictional books about pandemics and viruses sweeping around the world. There have been nonfiction books. There have been movies. You cannot say that we did not know. In 1988, Josh Lederberg, who had won the Nobel Prize previously for his work on bacteria, wrote this essay called Medical Science, Infectious Disease, and the Unity of Humankind. In it, he said, "We have too many illusions that we can govern the microbes that remain our competitors for the domination of the planet." And he also said, "The opening of wild lands to human occupation has exposed people to unaccustomed viruses and zoonosis." And he concludes the single biggest threat to our continued dominance on the planet is the virus. So why didn't we pay attention when there were early warnings in late 2019 of a new virus? It's because we saw that virus, as we see climate change today, as a distant issue that doesn't matter to us here and now. This is a phenomenon known as psychological distance, where we see something as being distant in time, mattering to people in the future or us in the future or future generations, but not here and now, to people or places that are distant in space, over there, not here, concepts that are abstract rather than concrete, and concepts that are irrelevant to our primary concerns. This applies directly to climate change today, and these maps from the Yale program on climate communication show just how powerful the effect of psychological distance is in determining our perspectives and attitudes on climate change. When you ask people, do you think global warming is happening? 72% of people say yes. And then you say, do you think it will harm plants and animals? About the same number say yes. Will it harm future generations? Yes. I know it looks like the same map, but it's actually a different one. People agree. So it will harm plants and animals. It will harm future generations. Will it harm people in developing countries? Now we're down to about 65%. You start to see a few blue areas where less than 50% of the population says yes. But by and large, most people still agree that it will affect people in the future and it will affect people who live far away. Then you say, will it harm people in the US? And the numbers drop again a little bit to 61%. And then they asked, will it affect you? Oh my goodness, all of a sudden the map goes blue. There is a huge drop, almost 20%, in the number of people who think it will affect them. If you're wondering about the yellow counties, the most concerned people in the US by demographics are Hispanic Catholics and also Native Americans. So I think that kind of accounts for some of the orange counties. But overall, this map paints an unmistakable image of psychological distance. Even though we agree it's happening, it will harm future generations, people in developing countries, even our neighbor, we don't think it matters to us. And the same phenomena was at work with COVID. When we first heard about it, one of the first news articles I could find was from January 5th, and the title was this: Pneumonia of Unknown Cause in China. And it talks about how there was a pneumonia in Wuhan City, and there were 44 patients who had it. 11 were severely ill, and the concern was that people had gone to the market. So you read this headline, and it seems very distant in time and in space. So in the first week in March in 2020, I was getting ready to go to Ireland for a series of events that I had collected and bundled to reduce my carbon footprint. I think I had something like 18 or 19 different lectures or panels lined up to do in 11 days. As I was packing my bag, my husband said to me, well, aren't you worried at all about this pandemic? And I said to him, oh no. I said, I'm from Toronto. I don't know somebody who had SARS, but I know somebody who knows somebody who had SARS. They had people who had the swine flu and the bird flu there too. Life proceeded as normal. You just had to be a bit more careful if you're exposed. I didn't think twice about it. So I packed my bag, I went off to Ireland, and you can guess what happened. I actually made it halfway through the scheduled events before everything shut down almost overnight. And I just left the country, probably about 24 hours, I think, before the entire country locked down. It became illegal to travel more than 2 kilometers from where you were living. So I even experienced this psychological distance from the COVID pandemic. And here's the interesting thing. Over here on the left, you can see the number of Americans that said that they were concerned, either very or somewhat concerned, about COVID from February to March 2020. In February, it was running around 40%, and then you can see in March, right when I was going to Ireland, it was ticking steadily upward, and by the second week in March, it got to about 60%. Well, here's the interesting thing. According to the Yale program on climate communication, 58% of us are currently either alarmed or concerned about the impacts of a changing climate. So in terms of where we are on climate change, it's as if we're in about the second or third week in March. Think back to mid-March. Think back to what people were thinking about and doing then. That's where our levels of concern are on climate change. Isn't that interesting? Here's the thing though. They're not necessarily increasing fast enough because we won't see the impacts of climate change until quite a bit after we make the choices that will determine our future. So while our levels of concern about climate change are increasing and while our psychological distance is decreasing, it isn't happening fast enough yet. So that's number 3. What's number 4? The fact that both COVID and climate change are public health crises that matter to all of us. How is climate change a health issue? Well, first of all, the extraction, processing, and combustion of fossil fuels are a direct health issue in and of themselves before we even get to the greenhouse gases. Combustion of fossil fuels is the primary source of air pollution in most industrialized countries, and it's a rapidly growing source of air pollution in many emerging economies like India. Air pollution is responsible for 100,000 deaths in the US every year and millions of deaths around the world. Air pollution is not fair. It disproportionately affects people who live in poor neighborhoods who can't afford to live somewhere better. And the extraction and processing of the fossil fuels also has health impacts in the Niger Delta, in areas where fracking is common, even indirectly, as this fascinating Lancet article talks about the collapse of the Venezuelan health system. It talks about how when oil prices began to fall in 2004, the tide turned and their oil reserves couldn't stave off economic collapse. The impact on the healthcare system was exacerbated by controls on exchange rate, which led to a shortage of the foreign currency needed to import equipment, food, and medicine. But then there's the direct impacts of climate change. And these are many. We often think immediately of the fact that climate change is leading to increased risk of heat waves, heat-related illnesses and deaths, and that absolutely is true. But that is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to climate impacts. Next, the warmer it is, the faster the reactions happen that turn our emissions into ground-level ozone, so it increases air pollution as well. We also know that as carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere increase, plants like ragweed produce more pollen and our allergies get worse. Climate change is loading the weather dice against us, making events like floods and hurricanes and coastal storms stronger, more intense, and more damaging. These impact our health immediately if we're harmed during the event, and they also have long-term impacts on our mental health as people try to recover from these extreme events. Climate change is also increasing the risk of heavy downpours, which can lead to water contamination. And of course, waterborne disease is an enormous problem, not just here in North America, but around the world. You've also got extreme flooding, for example, during storms. And 2 years ago in Texas, we had Hurricane Harvey. Hurricane Harvey's rainfall, up to 50 inches in some places, was so record-breaking that it flooded some Superfund sites. And of course, these sites were already located in marginalized or poor neighborhoods where people couldn't fight the site being put there. And so they're the ones whose homes and whose parks and whose places of work were flooded not just by floodwaters, but by floodwaters with toxins in them from the Superfund site. How else does climate change affect our health? Well, it's affecting the geographic range of things like ticks that carry Lyme disease and mosquitoes that carry Zika and chikungunya. The phrase eco-anxiety has become one that we now talk about on a regular basis. It's defined as a chronic fear of environmental doom. It's a sense of anxiety, Wikipedia defines it, primarily based on human-induced climate change, awareness of the increasing risks that we face. Then, I know this is a long list, but there's a lot of ways that climate change is affecting our health. It is affecting the nutritional content of our food. Higher CO2 levels mean that things grow faster, so you get something that's bigger, but it only has the same amount of nutrients in it. So per pound or per unit, it has less nutrition than it would have otherwise. And perhaps the biggest impact of climate change is the impact that it is having on our social and political systems, increasing conflict, increasing resource scarcity, increasing the risk of environmental migrants or climate refugees. When our political and social and civil systems break down, what's one of the first things to go? The public health system. And so, people end up dying from completely preventable things like having a baby or stepping on a rusty nail, when if we had a functioning health system, they'd be able to get treatment for that. So climate change affects our health in a multitude of ways, and we all care about that. But there's a connection to COVID too, because did you know that repeated exposure to air pollution leaves your lungs more vulnerable? So when you're exposed to coronavirus, you're more likely to get it, and when you get it, you're much more likely to get even more sick. They saw this with SARS too, almost 20 years ago. This isn't the first time it's been observed. And so there's a direct connection, especially that they're seeing, for example, in U.S. cities where marginalized populations like African Americans, for example, in the city of Chicago, which make up about 30% of the population, are actually experiencing about 70% of the deaths because of their pre-existing exposure to air pollution. A study looking at 4 different countries found that 80% of the deaths in those 4 countries occurred in the most polluted areas. So both climate change and COVID are health crises. What's number 5? The 5th thing they have in common is that both of them devastate our welfare and the economy. It's still hard to estimate what the eventual economic fallout of coronavirus will be. Between April and June of this year, the International Labor Organization estimated that 400 million full-time jobs were lost around the world. The income earned by workers dropped about 10% in the first 9 months of this year. The United States Census Bureau, looking week by week, found, for example, in midsummer, that 51% of people responding to the survey reported a loss in employment income, 12% reported food scarcity, 40% delayed getting medical care, and 26% reported housing insecurity. What about climate change? Well, if we think COVID's expensive, climate change, unchecked by the end of the century, could end up costing us about $1 quadrillion. And here's number 6. Number 6 is the fact that these impacts are not fair. They disproportionately affect the poorest and most vulnerable people on the planet. As Oxfam showed, the 10% richest people in the world produce 50% of carbon emissions, but those who are suffering the impacts include women and children, especially in poor countries, indigenous peoples here in the US and around the world, communities that are already marginalized, including communities of color right here in the US. A study done at Stanford last year found that climate change has already increased the gap between the richest and poorest countries in the world since 1960 by as much as 25% in some cases. And what's happening with COVID? Pretty much exactly the same thing. A new study by UNICEF in September found that COVID has already pushed millions more children deeper into poverty. In April, the World Bank originally suggested that coronavirus pandemic would be pushing about 40 to 60 million people into poverty, which they define as living on less than $1.90 a day. In June, they updated that to 70 to 100 million people, and then in November, they updated it to somewhere between about 90 to 150 million people, so almost double. A United Nations policy brief that was released in October found that people living in poverty were more exposed to COVID, first of all, and they were more exposed to the economic impacts as well. So they said that this crisis is creating a vicious cycle between growing poverty and inequality. They found specifically that the most vulnerable people have been hit hardest by both the lockdowns and by the direct health impact of the pandemic. While people who have high skills jobs are more likely to be able to work online from home, like most of us, and thus enjoy significantly more protection. Climate change and COVID are not fair. They increase the fault lines that already run through our society, increasing the risks of poverty, hunger, lack of access to basic health care, gender equality, and more. We're only at 6, though. We have a few more to go. What's number 7? When the solutions become imminent, that's when the politicization of these issues soars. A new Pew Foundation study just a couple of weeks ago found that the United States is actually exceptional in the nature of its political divide. All over the world, society is fragmenting and becoming more and more tribalized, it seems, but the U.S. really is exceptional. And when the Pew Foundation surveyed people back in February, again, when about 40% of people were concerned about COVID back then, but there was no solutions being implemented at that time, what they found is that climate change and environmental protection continued to be the top most politically polarized issues in the whole U.S. And this has been a common pattern going all the way back to the Obama administration. What you're looking at here is you're looking at a red dot for Republicans who say that an issue is a priority and a blue dot for Democrats. And the width of the gray bar tells you how far apart people are. And this graph is ranked based on how wide the gray bar is. Well, you can guess that as soon as the proposed solutions, lockdowns, shutdowns, wearing a mask came in, all of a sudden they became politicized also. And so what happened to the figure I just showed you? Well, the Pew Foundation redid their survey in August, and here's what they found. Now here, it's not ranked in order of the width of the gray bar, so I'll point them out to you. It turns out that the coronavirus outbreak is, as of August, the third most politically polarized issue in the whole country, the third widest gray bar. Race and ethnic inequality is number 2. And what's number 1? Climate change. Yes, it's still at the top. And social media plays a huge role in spreading the disinformation about climate change and about COVID. Mark Twain is attributed to the saying that a lie can circle the world while truth is still getting its boots on. But studies have actually shown that misinformation travels faster on Twitter than real information. We've seen this with climate change, and we have seen it in spades with COVID. And I was fascinated to see that many of the people on social media, the organizations, the trolls and more, who regularly reject the reality of climate science, as soon as the lockdowns came into effect, as soon as people were told to wear masks, they started to spread disinformation on this too. There was a study that came out of Cornell University that you might have seen back in October that found that 38% of the misinformation about COVID in the US that was spread actually originated with Trump. And of course, he and the White House spokespeople have also variously claimed over the years that climate change is not real. It's cold outside, so there's no global warming, or it was a hoax created by the Chinese. They've claimed that it's not humans, that climate just changes all the time and this is natural. They've claimed that it's not serious, that the National Climate Assessment just uses the most extreme scenario, and if you look at another scenario, it's not so bad. Well, of course, their actions were actually virtually ensuring that we would meet the highest scenario. They also argue that scientists don't agree, that they have scientists who can say that it isn't real or it isn't a big deal. And of course, that we can't fix it. The Paris Agreement would destroy the economy and we shouldn't do it. Even though it turns out if you put the National Climate Assessment, released in 2018, together with the State of the Carbon Cycle report, which was released the same day, Black Friday 2018, you put those two together and it actually shows that in terms of economic impacts on a handful of sectors alone, the United States would financially benefit from meeting its Paris agreements over a time horizon ranging from 5 to at the most 20 years. And remember, that's only a few sectors. If you include more sectors, that range would go down. So what's number 8? Number 8 is this. The media amplifies the negative voices. It makes it seem, these days, like everybody has just lost their collective mind. Like 80% of the population are mask deniers, COVID deniers, and climate deniers. And it makes us feel frustrated, depressed, alone, anxious, and scared. I often hear from people as a result who want to know how to convince dismissives because of the way that dismissives are presented in the media and the fact that dismissives are the loudest voices in the comment section of any article or on social media themselves. People want to know how to convince dismissives that climate change is real. Here's the thing. There aren't that many dismissives. And there aren't that many, although there certainly are some. I live in Lubbock, Texas, so I know quite a few. There aren't that many mask deniers either necessarily. But they are there, and we hear about them a lot in the media. The 6 Americas of Global Warming from the Yale Program on Climate Communication is an incredibly valuable resource, in my opinion, because it shows us how skewed our perspective can be. It turns out that, like I said before, the vast majority of us are already alarmed or concerned about climate change. 20% are cautious, 7% are disengaged, 11% are doubtful, only 7% are dismissive. Only 7%. We don't have to convince the 7% to move ahead. We just have to convince the 93%, and that is a lot easier task. I was reading an advice column the other day to parents and children. And one poor teenager wrote in and he said, well, how can I have this conversation with my parents because they're so racist? How can I persuade them to be less racist? And here's what the advice columnist wrote. And as I read it, I thought this applies directly to climate change and COVID too. He said, people fall into 3 buckets. They're racist, they're active racist, and there's a very large bucket of people who quietly go about their lives. Sound familiar? The key to establishing an anti-racist society, and so I would say the key to climate action, is not trying to move people from the racist bucket or the dismissive bucket into the actively anti-racist bucket or the alarmed category of the 6 Americas, but rather moving people from the giant ambivalent bucket, so people who are concerned or cautious or disengaged, over to the active one. Isn't that interesting? So people often think that I talk to dismissives, but I don't. My personal definition of a dismissive is somebody who, if an angel from God with brand new tablets of stone appeared before them, saying global warming is real in foot-high letters of flame, and it wouldn't change their mind, they're dismissive. Another way to put it is, all the scientists, all the facts, all the scientific reports, even the evidence of their own eyes would not be enough to convince them that climate change is real. So why would I think that I can? I can't. But the good news is the dismissives are only a tiny proportion of the population. Even so, though, what COVID has brought home to us and made personal is how absolutely devastating it can be when people will deny something like a global pandemic and global climate change too, even when it is literally in their face. There was an article a week or 2 ago that you might have seen. I saw it. I know Jen saw it. We talked about it together because it was just so heartbreaking. It was about that nurse from South Dakota who talked about how many patients she has that deny they have COVID up until the very end. They say they've got pneumonia or the flu or lung cancer. They challenge the doctors and the nurses and they say, why are you wearing protective gear? Rather than FaceTiming their family, the nurse said, they're just arguing over why they're being treated like they have an infectious disease. And then some of them even die. This type of news, whether we hear about it or whether we see it personally, is heartbreaking. It's discouraging. So that is why it's so important to emphasize that hope does not find us. We have to go out and look for it. But when we go out and look for it, it is there. Bloomberg recently had a survey showing which countries in the world are doing best at COVID. New Zealand topped the list. We all know the example of New Zealand. Their recent cases per day are at 0. But there's also some surprises on this list, like Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, Finland, Norway, Australia, China, Denmark. There's even some good news with air pollution and climate when it comes to COVID. If you remember the maps back in January, February, March, and April, showing that there were massive drops in air pollution as the lockdown rolled around the world. And then, of course, we know that carbon emissions dropped as industry shut down, as transportation was reduced. And it's estimated, for example, in the month of April, that global carbon emissions were down by 17%. Of course, they're just bouncing right back up again as the economy kickstarts back into recovery mode. But here's the really amazing thing. I want you to listen to this very carefully. According to the IPCC 1.5 degree report, we have to reduce our global carbon emissions about 50% by 2030 and almost 100% by 2050 in order to meet a 1.5 degree target. That sounds like a lot. But here's the amazing thing. We were 1/3 of the way to our 2030 target globally in a matter of weeks this spring. Weeks. We were 1/3 of the way to our 2030 target for 1.5 degrees in terms of our carbon emission reductions in a matter of weeks. Now, why was it not permanent? Because it wasn't achieved through sustainable methods. Locking down industry, taking kids out of school, shutting everything down are obviously not sustainable. What are sustainable solutions to climate change? Number 1, efficiency. U.S. carbon emissions could be reduced 50% through efficiency alone, one report found just last fall. Clean energy. Electrifying what we can, creating carbon neutral fuels for what we can't, and of course drawing carbon down into the soil and the biosphere. These are sustainable solutions, but they exist. We don't have to wait for them. They're already here. And the amazing thing that COVID has shown us is that when we act quickly, we can see incredible results. Some of these results are lasting. Cities like Bristol and Milan are changing the way that people can walk and bike and be transported through the city. In Canada, to get COVID relief, companies have to disclose their climate impacts. In France, Air France was called to reduce their carbon emissions 50% in order to get a government bailout. Carbon Brief has been tracking green recovery plans around the world, and amazingly, an International Energy Report just came out last month that found that in 2020, they estimate 90% of new electricity installed around the world in 2020 during the pandemic will be clean, renewable energy. So the last and the most important thing that climate change and COVID have in common is this. They have both shown us that swift action can work. Imagine living in New Zealand or Thailand or Australia right now where there isn't any COVID in your city. Imagine living in a world where we have blue sky and clean water and rapidly dropping carbon emissions that's powered by clean energy. The reality is that when we act quickly, we can tackle and meet a global challenge. So that leaves us with just one question. When it comes to climate change, what are we waiting for?